My job, our job, is quite straightforward. We're going to show the British public who pay for this service that we know and will never, ever again forget what we're here to do. We're here to serve the public. Today, I want to talk about the future, about new ideas, a new relationship with our audience. But it would be wrong not to acknowledge that we do this in the shadow of some very serious failings, in the shadow of what happened over Savile and also the payoffs.
Due to time constraints, we will not explore the damning scandals that have plagued the BBC. It must be said, however, that as more and more evidence comes to light, it becomes clearer and clearer that the BBC knowingly protected a lifelong pedophile in Jimmy Saville. So when Director General Hall refers to the so-called Savile affair as a, quote, failing, it is noteworthy given that Savile is now thought to have sexually preyed on hundreds of victims, the youngest being just 2 years old. Not only that, but Savile is known to have committed many of these heinous crimes on BBC property over the course of decades, all the while remaining one of the BBC's biggest stars. So it makes sense that the BBC would simply like to gloss this over and move on, as it were.
I've spent a good part of my working life in BBC News, and I profoundly believe in its singular importance.
Aloha, and welcome back. As I said earlier this year, I'll be producing more videos than I have in 2016 and 17, and I'll be discussing all the regular subjects that I do, but I also, in addition, will be discussing some other issues and matters that I haven't done so much of in the past, philosophy, nutrition, as a couple of examples. Now, before I get into this video, I also want to thank everybody who's been supporting on Patreon and otherwise, people who are sharing the videos, liking the videos. I always like to make sure and thank everybody. Honestly, it means a tremendous amount to me, and it does indeed mean that we are working together. By helping me in this way, I promise you the content of what I produce is going to be that much better. So thank you from the bottom of my heart once again, and let's get on with the video. Now this is the BBC production that I made for Press TV. If you don't know already, I've been on BBC several times. I pretty much sacrificed my BBC invitations with not only this production for Press TV, but many things I've said publicly. The BBC has this veneer of authenticity, or at least it has up until recent times. This is one of the benefits of the Donald Trump populist talking points that if you ask me, he's been allowed by his masters to discuss. This fake news issue is music to the ears for those of us who know very well from the inside the workings of the mass media. And of course, the BBC over a period of decades has had a reputation as being one of the most credible news sources, even perhaps the most credible news source, and their reach is simply astounding. The BBC is the #1 propaganda machine of all time. It is tremendously powerful and influential. But thank God for the fake news talking point agenda, which we hear so much about now, because while the powers that be are having to expose this issue of fake news, they're trying to now morph it into the Russians and other ridiculous sources of misinformation, when in fact it is the mainstream media, whether it's BBC, Fox, Sky News, CNN, MSNBC, they're all the same. They really are. But they're different in terms of the way they present themselves. The BBC is a little more refined than, say, Fox News, but they are all propaganda nonetheless. And of course, let us not forget, while we hear so much in the news about fake news and Russia, Israel, Israel and the Jewish supremacists who control the mainstream media and own Hollywood are the biggest purveyors of lies and propaganda of all, certainly in the Western world. The idea that Israel gets a pass and is not discussed in any meaningful way when we talk about fake news just goes to show who's actually producing the fake news in the first place. Once again, it is a mass media industry dominated by Jewish supremacist, Talmudic, Satanist, pedophile, bankster, cultist types. They work for the bankers, they are the bankers, and the biggest amount of fake news comes from them. So, of course, while we hear this in the news, this discussions and talking points, let us not mistake the fact that there are literally armies of people who work for Israeli interests. In fact, in the military, they have their own special unit that is completely dedicated to trolling the internet effectively and throwing out false, manipulative agendas and comments to try and throw people off track of the real truth, which is Israel's behavior in the Middle East, its never-ending fostering of war and conflict, and ultimately its illegality, unlawful nature in the first place, and of course the absolute right of the Palestinian people, according to international law, to ultimately return home to Palestine. The biggest interests of all in this world in keeping these lies hidden are the ones who are now putting this fake news agenda in front of us. So it's quite ironic, but of course in this Orwellian world of ours, very, very fitting. Now, in this production about the BBC, I have to say I really felt the need to go right for the throat. And I did my best to do that. And I really harp on a couple of issues, but in particular, 9/11. I hope that those of you who know the truth about 9/11, or those of you who may not quite understand the level of deception with regard to 9/11, will appreciate and get something of value out of this film. The other thing I'd like to mention just briefly is Jimmy Saville.
What sort of things happened in Jimmy Savile's dressing room?
That's when the other guests on the show would come in, generally after the show had finished. They would come in and they clearly saw girls and, well, kids, male and female, as being there to be used. I had a famous person who would try. He smelled awful. He smelled of sweat and alcohol, and it made me heave just to be near him, so I certainly didn't want him to do anything to me.
Gary Glitter also appeared on Clunk Click. He too would join Jimmy Savile and his young guests in the dressing rooms after the show. They couldn't fail to be impressed.
Right, I'm going to do a quick check on our beanbags. Did you like Gary's new record? Put your hand up if you like Gary's new record.
And all of us, of course, totally overawed by the fact that we were meeting all these famous people. And obviously that particular famous person wanted to have sex with one of the girls.
Gary Glitter is now a convicted child sex offender, but he denies these new allegations.
Now then.
In the studio, some of the young guests came from the secure hospital Broadmoor.
Get yourselves there like that. Just put yourself in there.
I get two.
You get two. In there. Oh. I should be giving girls away. That's the same as that. I'm going to get some down here. We've got them here from Broadmoor. We've got them from all over here.
Savile's charity fundraising, he's said to have raised more than £40 million, gave him special access to many institutions and to vulnerable children.
See you next week for another Clunk Click.
Now, Jimmy Savile worked for the BBC for many years. Jimmy Savile, if you don't know, was a talk show host, or he was the presenter for Top of the Pops, which was the #1 show in England for many, many years. He mixed with royalty, the monarchs, the king and queen, or excuse me, the Queen of England and others. This man was completely and totally accepted into the upper crust of society, and was given a knighthood, became a sir. Jimmy Savile, I don't even know what the latest numbers are, but literally this man violated hundreds of individuals. He was protected by the BBC all the while, and there was a investigation into BBC's role in his activities. Of course, this was supposed to be independent, but it took years and years. They delayed it for a long, long time. At the end of the day, of course, it was an absolute whitewash. But let us make no mistake about it. Within the higher echelons of power, pedophilia is an instrumental part of it. And if you asked me, part of the amazing complicity, the amazing silence within the upper echelons of power amongst the puppet class, i.e. the prime ministers and the presidents and congressmen and senators and so on and so forth. Amongst this class of people, especially at the highest levels, the prime minister and president, again, keep in mind, these are high levels of puppets. They're not actual powers. None of the real powers present themselves in front of you in the public view. That's the nature of power. That would be stupid. You want to keep your pawns out front so that you can sacrifice the pawn if necessary. Don't want to sacrifice yourself, which means you keep yourself out of the public eye. But in order to control the puppets who they have in the public eye, effectively, if you're not already a pedophile, then they will invite you to participate in having sexual affairs with little boys and little girls. This seems outrageous and unbelievable to a lot of people, but make no mistake about it, if you have a videotape of someone having sex with a little boy or a little girl, and you have that on video, you own them. And if you're a psychopath, like those who run the world, you have to admit it'd be a pretty effective way to keep people silent, wouldn't it? It would also ensure that the only people that would be allowed into the upper echelons of power would be psychopaths, sociopaths, narcissists, and things of this nature, because only people of that nature would be able or willing to do something so disgusting and horrible as have sex with a little boy or little girl. Or perhaps these people also are the kinds of people you want to maintain your lies, and in order to control them, you compromise them. So if they don't have sex with a little boy or a little girl, maybe they participate in a child sacrifice. Again, I know this sounds completely outrageous to a lot of people, and this is where it becomes critically important to open your mind and be willing to accept possibilities which seem almost too dark for humanity to be involved in any meaningful way. But make no mistake about it, this is part of the linchpin of how this tyrannical system is maintained. Look up Jeffrey Epstein, Lolita Express, and as one last example of just how pervasive this actual system of maintenance of power is, I have to bring up Bill Clinton, the former president of the United States, who was very famously on board the Lolita Express. The Lolita Express is a private jet owned by Jeffrey Epstein, a convicted pedophile. Bill Clinton, on record, has flown with Jeffrey Epstein on the Lolita Express. In fact, when he did so, something very, very interesting happened. You see, former presidents are given a Secret Service detachment which follows them everywhere they go 24/7 for fairly obvious reasons. They don't want their puppets getting murdered, so they have this security with them all the time. The only thing is, Bill Clinton dismissed his Secret Service detachments. And now, in order to do that, you generally have to fill out paperwork. But that paperwork would require that you explain why you are dismissing your detachment of Secret Service, who is there to protect you. Of course, that would be a bit problematic if you're Bill Clinton and you want to fly with a convicted pedophile on the Lolita Express, which is expressly used to transport people down to an island in the U.S. Virgin Islands, which is no accident. The U.S. Virgin Islands, of course, being under U.S. jurisdiction, would be a good place to take people from around the world at the upper echelons of power, including Prince Andrew, as an example, to the island in which these individuals have sex with little boys and little girls, and these things are videotaped. Bill Clinton dismissed his Secret Service detachment so that he could fly on the Lolita Express with a convicted pedophile to an island known to be used to have sex, for people to have sex with children. And he didn't explain why he dismissed his Secret Service detachment, because he was going to have sex with a little boy or a little girl. From what we understand, I believe it was a little girl, but these individuals oftentimes swing both ways, as it were. Not that it really matters, but homosexuality is certainly a big part of what many of these men in these positions of power do. In fact, from what we can tell, Barack Obama is very fond of men, if you will. So either way, compromising these puppets is an important part. You, not being a psychopath, might have a hard time understanding it, and all of us, quite frankly, who are not psychopaths, have a kind of hard time understanding just how dark and ugly one must be to even consider such practices, but they are pervasive and dominant within the system of power we have today. So the BBC is at the core of this and protected a pedophile of the worst nature in Jimmy Saville. And ultimately, the BBC, if you ask me, along with all the other fake news prostitutes of propaganda out there, they don't need to just be condemned. What we need to see eventually is war crimes charges, because propaganda, war propaganda, is a war crime. And so we can very, very easily take all the evidence that the mainstream media has provided us and ultimately put many of these bastards in jail. And that is, of course, exactly what many of them deserve. So I hope you enjoy this program, this expose of the BBC. I will plan on putting part 2 out within a week or so, but for now, you have part 1. So enjoy.
The mainstream media is increasingly understood as an instrument of power and control for the few, and thus overwhelmingly hostile to the public interest. For ever-growing numbers of people, the true agenda of the mass media is to disinform, obfuscate, omit, and otherwise manipulate the public into policies that concentrate power and justify perpetual war. But among the giants within this insidious business is a Goliath that stands above all others, the BBC. In this edition of In Focus, we shall explore the true function of the BBC and the reality of paying for propaganda in the 21st century. In the interest of full disclosure, I must declare my personal relationship with the BBC as a guest on Hallmark BBC programs including Newsnight, Panorama, BBC News, and Hard Talk. Based on my personal experience with the BBC that were overwhelmingly hostile experiences, along with years of analyzing the BBC, it is clear to me that the BBC is an extension of the UK government and a dangerous propaganda machine masquerading as a news outlet. Having said that, my personal feelings are irrelevant, but my personal experiences give great insight into the true nature of the BBC.
My guest today fought as a US Marine in the Gulf War, but is now going to Iraq for a very different reason. His plan to lead a group of anti-war protesters and offer himself as a human shield in the event that an attack takes place. Is he an idealist or just a willing tool for Iraqi propaganda? Mr. O'Keefe, how many anti-government demonstrations do you see in Iraq?
How many anti-government demonstrations? They don't exist.
No,
and
they don't exist.
You and I both know that.
Exactly.
You and I both know that.
Exactly.
Ken O'Keefe, my guest today, was on that boat and involved in the violence. So was it worth it? Israel might be the first to say that it regrets loss of life, but the argument is the extent of provocation. They say it was self-defense. And one of the commandos describes, the fourth commander to come down, describes landing and seeing his team leader with his own pistol being held to his head. And he says that is why he fired.
Despite the fact that I've accommodated BBC interview requests on numerous occasions, the favor has not been returned. For the last 18 months, however, every attempt has been made to interview a BBC representative. After months of running around the houses with no positive result forthcoming, I changed tactics and secured the backing of 13 British citizens who have collectively paid the BBC license fee for a total of 465 years. Even with the backing of these BBC license payers, the BBC flat out refused to do any interview anywhere, anytime. Subsequently, we do not have an interview with a BBC representative. Instead, we've used representative clips from the current Director General.
My job, our job, is quite straightforward. We're going to show the British public who pay for this service that we know and will never, ever again forget what we're here to do. We're here to serve the public. Today, I want to talk about the future, about new ideas, a new relationship with our audience. But it would be wrong not to acknowledge that we do this in the shadow of some very serious failings, in the shadow of what happened over Savile and also the payoffs.
Due to time constraints, we will not explore the damning scandals that have plagued the BBC. It must be said, however, that as more and more evidence comes to light, it becomes clearer and clearer that the BBC knowingly protected a lifelong pedophile in Jimmy Savile. So when Director General Hall refers to the so-called Savile affair as a, quote, failing, it is noteworthy given that Savile is now thought to have sexually preyed on hundreds of victims, the youngest being just 2 years old. Not only that, but Savile is known to have committed many of these heinous crimes on BBC property over the course of decades, all the while remaining one of the BBC's biggest stars. So it makes sense that the BBC would simply like to gloss this over and move on, as it were.
I've spent a good part of my working life in BBC News, and I profoundly believe in its singular importance.
BBC is a model created by the British to control all the other news TV in the world. And you know that most of the TV channels in the world receive training from BBC. So as everybody is copying the same model, everybody is copying the same content. And so you have a big choice between Al Jazeera, France 24, BBC, a lot of channels, but they are all the same channel.
What we don't always see clearly is that over the past 80 years, we've built a global news service that is trusted, is respected, and relied on by up to 250 million people around the world.
Despite the massive audience, serious journalists increasingly reject the BBC as a credible news source regarding geopolitical issues. This is in large part due to its bias and inaccurate journalism, as well as its undeniably intimate relationship with the UK government.
Well, I've been watching the BBC since I was a teenager. when I'm in England, when I'm abroad, and when I'm in a hotel somewhere in the world, right? So I don't take their news coverage seriously anymore. Just to give an example, I was there when John Simpson proclaimed that he had conquered Kabul in 2001. I think that sums it all up, right? I have a lot of fun with the BBC 4, for instance, at 1 a.m. on a Saturday when I'm watching reruns of Top of the Pops. So this is great, but that's about it.
Nevertheless, the BBC remains the oldest, largest, and arguably the most influential media institution in the history of our world. The BBC has over 20,000 employees worldwide and an annual budget of over £5 billion. That's a larger budget than nearly half of the nations on this planet.
To be given the right to be funded by a license fee is a tremendous privilege. The people of this country, make a bold and generous commitment in paying for the BBC.
BBC license payers are generous indeed, but many of them are just downright frightened and intimidated. The BBC sends out 55 million pieces of junk mail annually. This junk mail threatens the public with £1,000 fines, involuntary searches of their homes, and even imprisonment. These methods extract roughly £3.7 billion from the UK public annually. But for those who simply refuse to pay, or those who simply cannot afford to pay the £145.50 a year, those people can expect increasingly hostile methods.
Yes, there's a TV set on number 5. It's in the front room. And they're watching Columbo.
If you don't have a TV license, it won't take us long to find you.
One of the things that TV license do, that we object to, is door-to-door harassment of people who don't have licenses, but of those, a number of them don't need licenses. So when they come round to doorstep us, we film them.
Resolve your licence situation.
I don't have a licence situation.
I know there's no licence at this address. That's why I'm calling.
I don't need a TV licence.
You don't have a TV?
I have a TV, but you don't need a TV licence to have a TV.
If you receive live broadcast, you need a licence.
I don't have live broadcast on the TV. I have a DVD player, which I use.
If you're prepared to let me confirm that...
No, I have children in the house. I do not have strange men in the house when I have children in the house.
Fine, that's okay. I'll refer it back and you'll be contacted again.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
What made me permanently go without a TV licence was the Newsnight scandal over the Savile investigation. That for me was the absolute final straw.
TV licensing?
We don't have TV.
Can I just come in and confirm that with you?
No, you ain't coming in my house.
Okay.
I don't have nothing to do with your paedophile ring, mate.
At the moment, we treat audiences like licence fee payers. We should be treating them like owners.
Why don't you come out and show yourself? Taking a picture through a my 9-year-old daughter's bedroom window. You're a pervert, the pair of you. You should be ashamed of yourselves.
The BBC will learn from criticism and welcome it.
TV licensing. For the video, please. For and on the record. Can I have your name? 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 Are you prepared to identify yourself? Are you prepared to identify yourself? You come here with empty threats, you've got nothing. You don't even know if I've got a telly. You don't even know if I'm using or liable to have to pay for a TV licence. You know nothing. You come to my door asking personal questions and you've got no rights. Power to the people.
The public owns us, and that is what it needs to feel like.
There's no licence at the premises, and you've confirmed there's a TV here, and you've not had a licence since 2011?
No, I never will have one either.
Right, okay, so you're confirming there's a TV at the premises? Yeah. What I'll do, I'll take some details off you, if that's okay with you. Is that okay?
Would you like to come in?
Would you mind, is that okay?
No, well, you know what's coming next, don't you?
Okay.
At the core of the BBC's role is something very simple, very democratic, and very important. And it is to bring the best to everyone. Wherever you are, whoever you are. Whether you're rich or poor, old or young. That's what we do.
So do you have a television?
I'm not obliged to say anything.
Right, what I'll do then, we'll put him for a search warrant.
Yeah, go on, yeah.
That's the only way we have round it.
Yeah.
Otherwise everyone in country would be as awkward as yourself. So
yeah,
what I'll do, I'll put
on.
him for a search warrant.
Yeah.
While police are wasting the time here,
yeah.
Let's hope they've not got better to do, eh?
Oh Christ, that'd be a nightmare.
All right, mate, you have that on your phone.
All right, yeah.
We'll make sure that everyone who should be paying the licence fee is.
I worked for the BBC for 30 years. When I was at the BBC, it promoted the licence fee by saying how wonderful it was. But now, the organisation you work for says, we know where you are. And I was so incensed by the idea that I'm guilty of something that I actually cancelled my TV licence fee a few months ago. Because I'm not going to have the BBC or any organisation threatening me.
There is widespread discontent about the BBC and about the licence fee, and that the last thing that we want is the German model where everybody has to pay irrespective of whether they actually watch TV or not.
It really is ever clear that the scandals and the threatening behavior is having a negative effect on the BBC. And actually about 10% of all cases in the UK court system deal with people's failure to pay the BBC licence fee. Really, it's anybody's guess just how much money the BBC would lose if indeed its threatening behavior was discontinued. So now let's take a look at the BBC Charter, the founding document of the BBC. Specifically, let's take a look at what the UK public are supposed to get in return for their money.
The key issue in the Charter is that the BBC must exercise what is called due impartiality, and that is normally understood to mean that it has to be accurate, but it also has to be balanced. It has to represent in a fair way a range of views, and that seems to me to be the key violation here.
The BBC has what's called a Royal Charter as well as editorial guidelines. And that's a social contract between the BBC and the British public. The British public are fee paying, they pay for their TV licence fee, which helps to fund the BBC. So that's essentially a contract between the BBC and the British public.
Now, let me quote from the BBC's editorial guidelines in the Charter. Impartiality lies at the heart of public service and is the core of the BBC's commitment to its audiences. Now, there's a case for saying that because of its reporting, its biased reporting, the BBC is in gross breach of that charter commitment.
And people in the public are reduced to literally banging on the doors of the BBC. Thousands of people outside having demonstrations because they simply no longer feel represented. They don't feel represented by the organisation that they are paying for.
The right to decide what is balanced and not balanced, what is fair and what is not fair, what can go in and what can't go in, has been handed to something called the BBC Trust. The BBC Trust are appointees to dictate the editorial policy, etc., of the BBC. And the BBC operates under a royal charter. A royal charter means that at the peak of that pyramid, officially, that controls the BBC, is the Queen. Now, the royal charter is controlled by the Queen, controls the BBC, and then under her is something called the Privy Council, privy meaning private. These are appointees, former politicians and lords and, people from the system. And through them and the government ministers of the day, and officially through the Queen, all these people are appointed to the BBC Trust, which dictates BBC editorial policy and says what's fair and what's not fair. And obviously, where you've only got to watch the BBC for a while, one of the conclusions they've come to is the Israeli version of everything can be given, because that's fair, and the Palestinian version of the same thing cannot be given, because that's unfair. They call it balance.
The most comprehensive study of BBC and actually ITV coverage of the Israel-Palestine conflict was carried out by Glasgow University's Media Research Group, which has a worldwide reputation as a centre of excellence for what it does. And in 2003-04, it carried out a long study. It analysed 200 hours of programmes. It interviewed at least 800 people, many of them journalists, reporters, editors, producers. And its conclusion was that the BBC's coverage of the conflict was biased in Israel's favour.
What we do when we study the media and content of media, and we've looked at a whole range of different areas, but essentially what we do is look at the range of explanations that are available on any given subject in public debate. So we would look at all the different positions, all the different perspectives, the different arguments, and the evidence that's available for each of those arguments. And then we simply compare that map of what is possible with what actually then goes out.
After the Glasgow University report was published, the report was called Bad News from Israel. Its group leader, Professor Greg Philo, said that they were approached by many journalists, especially from the BBC, saying, look, there are many reasons why we are under pressure to limit our criticism of Israel. And Greg said that they said to him, we'd like you to make this public because we can't.
The journalists were in some ways quite sympathetic to the Palestinians, in the sense that they would be sympathetic in a human sense to anyone who was suffering. So they would feature images of funerals, or of widows who were crying, or children who were suffering. Or that material would be on the television. And that would be, as far as the journalists were concerned, the Palestinian case. That would be the Palestinian side of the argument. And then on the other side, you would have all of the explanations about why this was happening, which were coming essentially from Israel and from the Israeli perspective.
This former national security advisor is even saying Israel could reoccupy the entire Gaza Strip as a last resort.
At the end of the day, we might be a situation in which we don't have any other alternative if Hamas will not stop launch rockets and missiles into Israel.
I think I would say, from my knowledge of the IDF and from the extent to which I've been following the current operation, I don't think that there has ever been a time in the history of warfare when any army has made more efforts to reduce civilian casualties and deaths of innocent people than the IDF is doing today in Gaza.
We tried to de-escalate. Messages were sent. We told Hamas to stop this rocket fire, but they continued. And now we are acting. The Israeli Defense Forces are acting to bring about a situation where the people of Israel no longer have to live in fear.
Back in the rubble, Salim's mother is calling on Hamas to avenge her son, who was about to graduate from college. Israel isn't ruling out a much broader offensive if Hamas attacks don't stop. The choice ahead now for Israel is withdraw or hit much harder. Orla Gearan, BBC News, on the Israel-Gaza border.
Well, undoubtedly, there are in the BBC some very senior people who are for Israel, right or wrong. And because it's biased in its coverage of reporting the Israel-Palestine conflict, people end up being misinformed or totally confused.
How can you talk about peace if you do not examine the causes of war? And that seems to me to be absolutely central. And that if the causes of a conflict are explained almost entirely from one side, then how can you even begin to discuss how to resolve a conflict? And the conflict in Israel and Palestine is so festering. It has so many impacts on the rest of the world and on conflicts elsewhere, that it's absolutely crucial that they move to some sort of solution in it. And I think the way in which it's being explained, the way in which it's discussed, the complete absence of any attempt to really get to the historical causes and reasons for it, other than to very largely repeat the Israeli account, that absence is, I think, very damaging to the public interest in this country. And I think it's a violation of what the BBC is supposed to do.
There were two groups, at least that I'm aware of Gazan Palestinians that brought cases within the within the UK courts, the United Kingdom courts, against the BBC for what they believed to be their biased coverage, because they were minimizing the casualties that were taking place in Gaza, even in some cases removing journalists who reported on civilian casualties.
So if you translate that then into public understanding, we then go out and ask people, and we say, well, did you see the pictures? They say, oh yes, it was terrible. I saw dreadful, dreadful pictures. Palestinian children dead. Oh, it was so sad. It was awful. People would say to me, I can remember a woman saying to me, I cried when I saw the pictures of the Palestinian children. But then the next thing she said was, but it didn't make me sympathize with the Palestinians, because the Palestinians don't want peace. And what she then did was to repeat the Israeli perspective. And we found this very commonly in the focus groups, that people would say, oh yes, it's awful for the Palestinians, it's terrible, but if only they would just accept peace, if only they would stop starting the trouble, if only they would stop stirring up the trouble. Because the perspective on why it was happening, on the history of it, on the reasons for it, all of that was dominated by the Israeli propaganda machines.
One of the most egregious examples of BBC bias was during the 2008-2009 Israeli bombardment of Gaza. Despite massive suffering, the BBC refused to broadcast the Disasters Emergency Committee charity appeal for the beleaguered people of Gaza. Keep in mind that Gaza's borders were completely closed, and thus the Palestinians had no place of refuge. Even worse, over 800,000 of Gaza's inhabitants at the time were children.
Today, this is not about the rights and wrongs of the conflict. These people simply need your help. Several hundred have been killed in Gaza in recent weeks. A large number of them have been children. Some of those who have survived are traumatized from the loss of loved ones. UK aid agencies report that 60% of the population is now living in poverty. Thousands are malnourished, with more than 1 million dependent on aid to survive.
People will die because of the BBC decision. Let me be clear about that. And I started my life 60 years ago as a BBC producer. I love the BBC. I support it. But it is capitulated to Israeli pressure. That's the truth, I have to tell you. I'm going to do it myself. Anyone who wants to contribute, I'm going to do that. And I'm sorry, you're not going to stop me. You're not going to stop me. I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. The Disaster Emergency Committee Gaza Crisis is available at P.O. Box 999, London, EC3A 3AA. And I know from the BBC, because I've been here most of the morning, nobody here agrees with what the BBC have done. 1,330 people have been killed, 460 children, 5,480 casualties, and the reason the BBC have done it is very simple. The Israeli government objected.
When journalism becomes little more than propaganda for the state, we might want to consider the dangers this poses not only to the people of Gaza, but to ourselves. For instance, what if the BBC is purposely withholding information that protects the terrorists responsible for 9/11?
The evidence for a controlled demolition is overwhelming. You have 2.25 seconds of free fall, which means 100 foot of that building disappeared. 8 stories disappeared and it fell through thin air. The BBC have treated that like the plague.
The argument is very simple and rational. If World Trade Center 7 was brought down by a controlled demolition, and if the BBC is withholding critically important information that essentially covers up this fact, then the BBC is literally protecting whoever is responsible for the destruction of WTC 7. Now that's not bad journalism, that is material support for terrorism. And in the next episode of In Focus, we shall reveal why this damning judgment is the only sensible and intelligent conclusion one can reach.